Welcome to the webinar, Note-Taking and Organizational Workflow Strategies, brought to you by the Graduate Writing Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. My name is Kelly France. I'm a Graduate Writing Center Fellow, and I will be taking us through this webinar. To give you an overview of how the webinar is structured, from talking to other Graduate Writing Center Fellows and staff, I've compiled a collection of note-taking, organization, and productivity strategies that work for them. The goal of this webinar is to expose you to different methods, strategies, and resources so that you can take what is useful for you and implement it into your own practice. Here's how the webinar will be organized. I've divided the webinar into 3 parts. First, we'll cover note-taking strategies, which includes taking notes during lectures and also taking notes on your readings. Then we'll cover brainstorming and planning strategies. This includes making connections across course materials and readings, organizing your ideas, and preparing to write. Finally, we'll cover some workflow and productivity strategies and tips, ways to find your flow in writing, and general ways to manage your productivity. Within each of these 3 sections, I'll do 3 things. First, I'll pose some questions to get you thinking about your own methods and preferences. Then I'll share some examples that the fellows and staff have provided, and you'll see a lot of variety here. And finally, based on these examples from the fellows, I've attempted to pull out some key ideas and common practices and create a list of tips. You'll see that although we have our different strategies, there seems to be some common underlying ideas about best practices. The most important thing to remember is that there is no single best strategy for note-taking, brainstorming, planning, or staying productive. The best strategy is the one that works for you. You can see that we all have different strategies, and many of us have played around with various methods before stumbling upon what works for us. And we're still learning from each other and discovering new techniques. This is all to say that everything will not be helpful for everyone. It may depend on your particular project or your goals for note-taking, planning, or your workflow. Let's begin by talking about note-taking. You can begin by asking yourself these 3 questions. Do you prefer to take notes by hand or on your computer? How do you keep all of your notes organized? And what is your purpose for note-taking? So why do we take notes? Taking notes allows us to remember and access information. It helps us keep all of the information organized. It also helps us stay focused and stay engaged while we're either listening to a lecture or reading an article. It helps assist in our thinking. It allows us to make connections and identify themes across sources, and it helps us prepare to write. Here are some tips for taking notes during lectures. It's a good idea to take notes during lectures because it allows you to listen actively and then also access the material afterwards. Before coming to class, reread the syllabus and skim the materials in advance so that you know the objectives and themes of that particular class session. This allows you to listen to the lecture and know what are the key ideas that you should write down because you know the purpose of that lecture. Don't write down everything. Instead, try just jotting down some key points and questions, and then if you can, immediately after class, spend a couple of minutes filling in the blanks with the details. This allows you to stay more engaged in the lecture and not be distracted by writing down every single detail. Also, reread your notes after the lecture. When you reread your notes, you can add some questions in the margins, you can pull out key themes, you can even highlight or color code ideas. I'll now share some examples of what some fellows and staff members at the Graduate Writing Center at TC do when they take notes for lectures. Marissa says, I've learned from different psych studies that we can code and store information better if we physically write it down by hand. So if I'm feeling really motivated, I write down my class notes on paper, and then I retype them into my Notion, which is a organizational and note-taking software, to have them on file to study in a clean format. Peter says he also takes notes by hand during class and then recopies them into a Google Doc organized by date, theme, and author names. This is a great way to review for a final paper, prepare for a literature review, and draw on past readings for Canvas discussion posts and reflection papers. This is an example of how I take notes through OneNote. For each class, I have my notes organized by date of the class session, and then within there, I keep my notes. If you can take pictures of the slides, you could do that, or you could just type in your notes or do both. This makes it easily accessible, and it's all organized by class session. Catherine does something similar with OneNote. She says, I'm a handwriting kind of person, so I take all of my course notes longhand via my iPad and pencil. I do a combination of writing and drawing when I take notes, and this helps me stay engaged. She also says, I use different colors for different purposes. For example, I designate green for links and connections to other ideas or texts. I use blue for my own thoughts and interpretations. I use pink for paraphrased ideas, and so on. One strategy you could try is Cornell Notes. Cornell Notes are broken into 3 parts. The main section in your notes are the notes that you take during class. So this could be main ideas, written in bullet points, maybe some diagrams or charts, some paraphrasing of the ideas from the lecture. So just the key points in the middle. Then, after class, you write a summary of those notes down at the bottom. This highlights the main ideas, and it's easier to go back to your notes and check the main idea later. Over on the left-hand side, you write different kinds of cues. So this would depend on your purpose for note-taking. You might write anticipated exam questions. You might just pull out some key themes or ideas or vocabulary words, and you can use this to study or review for a test. You can also use it to help you skim the notes later on when you're preparing to write or you're trying to make connections across your course notes and the course readings to prepare to write. Here's another example shared by Marissa. She said that I found that rephrasing the professor's language or the textbook's language in my own words when I take notes helps me process the information better. This is a great idea to paraphrase key ideas in your own words. So then when you go back and you read the notes, it's much clearer because you've written it in language that makes sense to you. In addition to taking notes on lectures, you also need to take notes on your readings. So here are some general tips for reading note-taking. Just like taking notes on lectures helps you listen actively, taking notes on your readings helps you read more actively and process the information better. One thing to keep in mind is not to overuse or abuse the highlighter. So if you highlight too much of the text, it won't be helpful for you when you return to the text to look for key information. Also, it helps to do something more than just highlight, like pull information out of the text in your own words and write it somewhere else. It helps you process the information better and just makes it more easily accessible if you need to use the information from the readings to then do some writing. So start with a plan or a system before you start reading or before you jump into a new class, have an idea of how you want to take notes on your readings. Organize and consolidate your reading notes. So beyond just highlighting or maybe taking some notes in the margins, see if you can organize all of that information in a single place so that all of your notes on your different readings are consolidated in one place. And you'll see examples of that in a moment. Like we mentioned earlier, it helps to write this information in your own words. But you can also save some key quotes that can help you spark your thinking. So you want to jump into your readings with a plan for active and organized note-taking. You have a lot of different options here. One option could be to print out your sources, your readings, highlight in the readings themselves, write notes in the margins or on sticky notes, and then transfer it to a central location. You might use note cards. For example, for each article you read, you could write a note card for that article with the citation information and then some key ideas on that note card. So then you'd end up with a stack of note cards with summaries of each of your readings. You might use a citation management software or another kind of document note-taking software to take notes on your readings, such as Mendeley or Zotero. You might use different software like OneNote or GoodNote. There are a lot of different software out there. You can also organize with Excel and Google Sheets, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. You could keep all of your notes organized in folders on your desktop or in Google Drive, or you could use online organizational note-taking tools like Notion. One place to start, if you do highlight in the text that you're reading, try color coding. For example, you could do this virtually or with a physical printout of the article. You can try color coding for main ideas, details, key quotes, connections to other readings or connections to your class notes, and sources like other article citations that you would like to explore further. So this is one way to go beyond just simply highlighting. You can use, like I mentioned, some note-taking software. These are just some examples like OneNote, Mendeley, or Zotero, which are citation management softwares, but they also have note-taking functions, GoodNote or Adobe Acrobat. This is an example of how Catherine takes notes on readings through OneNote. She says, within OneNote, I have separate notebooks for courses. Then I organize texts by weeks. Within each week, I add the PDF of the article and book chapters, which I annotate along with a page for class notes. This is an example of my Zotero platform. I use Zotero to organize all my readings by class and by project. I also read most of the PDFs on Zotero, and I highlight and annotate in different colors. So on the top, you can see that all of my articles are organized by different folders and subfolders depending on the project. And then on the bottom, you can see an example of some of my highlights in my notes on a particular article that I was reading. You can do the same thing with Mendeley. It has a similar function to Zotero. In addition to taking notes on each individual reading, you might want to think about a way to consolidate all of those notes into one easy to manage place. So you could do this with Excel sheets or Google Sheets. For example, in this Google Sheet, I was preparing to write a literature review, and you'll see on the left-hand side, I've listed all of the sources that I read for this literature review. Across the top are the key pieces of information that I wanted to pull out from each article. This includes the research question, the background or theoretical framework, the method, design, participants, the findings, and then perhaps the implication, some notes, or some quotes, depending on the kind of information that you think is relevant. This makes it easy to skim through the information from all of your studies, so it can help you notice similarities and differences across the articles that you're reading and make connections. Another platform that could help you consolidate all of your reading notes is Notion, which both Felicia and Marissa use. For literature reviews, for example, you can record the details of each source, such as the title, the authors, the year, the type, so like the citation information, and then you can create a page where you record the notes about each of those sources. Felicia, on the topic of using Notion for source notes, she says, "I find this helpful for me because I don't have to have several apps or documents open. Also, it helps me to locate everything I need in one application. It's useful for a forgetful person like me." As one final example, I'll take you through my own note-taking process for readings. So it's important to keep in mind that you might have to have multiple steps to your note-taking process. For me, I begin by reading the articles and then highlighting and leaving comments in my Zotero. I have different colored comment boxes for main ideas, details, quotes, and sources. So you can see my Zotero on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side is a sticky note that I have on my computer that reminds me what color to highlight for different ideas. After taking notes on a particular source, I transfer key ideas into either OneNote or a Google Sheet, and sometimes, depending on the project, I'll use both. I think that OneNote is good when I want to reread some information in more detail to spark some ideas and notice less obvious connections. I find that Google Sheets are good for logging just the main ideas, and it also allows me to filter topics and subtopics and see overall connections. For example, this is my OneNote when I'm preparing to write a literature review. So you'll see that it is organized by source. So each article has their own notes sheet, and then within that sheet I have the reference entry at the top and just some bullet points of notes. So this is quite detailed. On the other hand, sometimes together with OneNote, I use Google Sheets, where I also record the key information and I can code it by themes. So if I'm looking to find connections across studies in preparation for a literature review, I can code each of the studies by different levels of themes, and then I can filter those themes to notice how studies are connected to each other. As I'm taking these notes, I also like to keep a notebook next to me just to write down some key ideas or maybe just some random thoughts or connections that are coming up, but I don't have a organized place to put them. And then before moving on to the next article, I pull out the sources that I highlighted and then I add them to a running reference list to find later. So if one article includes multiple sources that I want to read later on, I pull that out when I'm done taking notes on that article and I save them somewhere in a new document. So this is a picture of what my process looks like. I have Zotero, I have either OneNote or Google Sheets on my other screen, and then I have a notepad just for some miscellaneous notes or ideas. So as you can see, note-taking on readings might involve a multi-step process. As you can see, our fellows and staff at the Graduate Writing Center here use a variety of different strategies and software and systems for taking notes in their lectures and in readings. While there's not one best way to take notes, based on all of these examples, we can pull out some key takeaways, some key best practices. So first would be to start out with a plan. Keep it organized, but don't be afraid to play around with different strategies. So you might find halfway through the process of doing a big assignment like a literature review that you might have to add another step to your note-taking process to fit with your project or to keep things more organized. That's okay, but go into note-taking with at least some kind of rough system in mind. It'll save you time in the long run. Also, take notes actively. So find ways to engage with the information besides just highlighting the text, for example. And try color coding, but avoid over-highlighting, of course. Like we've mentioned, be systematic. Plan a system for how you not just take notes on lectures and readings, but then organize all of those notes. And one way to organize those notes is to consolidate them into a single or a few places, like Excel sheets or something like Notion or OneNote or other note-taking systems. And try writing notes in your own words. This not only helps you process the information better and retain the information better, but it can also help you if you later on have to write about this information, because paraphrasing is hard. So if you do some of the paraphrasing part of the process before you start writing, it'll make that writing a bit easier. And keep in mind that how you take notes will depend on your purpose for note-taking. Maybe your aim is to make connections across readings and lectures. Maybe your aim is to prepare to write, or maybe your aim is to prepare for an exam. So this might determine the kinds of note-taking strategies that are most helpful for you. And that's all for part 1 of our note-taking and organizational workflow webinar, where we've covered lecture notes and reading notes. Part 2 will cover brainstorming and planning, so stay tuned.